Hi, my name's Darren Gladman. I'm with Clean Energy Council. Here we go. We're the peak body for the renewable energy industry in Australia. Like many people in the room, I imagine, I participated in the review of tariff structure statements, was it a few years ago? All those conversations about network pricing and reform of network tariffs. Like many of you, I expect, I found that a bit of a frustrating process in some regards, and this year, 2018, is now another year where we're going back into that conversation, and probably like many of you, I approached that with a bit of trepidation, thinking, oh gosh, here we go again. Are we going to be going around in circles with some of those same old arguments? So what I wanted to do today is reflect a little bit on some of the conversations and the assumptions that we had in that last round of discussions, and see if we can get somewhere this time around where we're perhaps not making what I think were some of the mistakes we made last time. So just to refresh your memory of where we got to last time, it really was baby steps. Like, we really started the journey towards more cost-reflective tariffs. In Victoria, there was a reduction in the threshold for mandatory demand tariffs for businesses to either 40 or 60 megawatt hours per annum, depending what network you're in. In some networks, that wasn't a significant change. In some, it was. In the ACT, we have a live experiment going on now with demand tariffs for new residential and low voltage commercial customers, and for new meters and replacement meters with an opt-out to time of use. That's only been up and running since, I think, 1 December last year, so I haven't seen any statistics from that yet, but I'm looking forward to seeing the stats that come out of that. Most other networks only offered demand tariffs on an opt-in basis, and Ausgrid, I understand, doesn't even offer demand tariffs on an opt-in basis. So that's just to bring you up to speed with where we got to last time. I expect that's a pretty familiar story for many of you in the room. What I want to do, the next thing is to look at where we've got from those baby steps. And so far, I haven't seen a lot of detailed reporting on the success, but from the conversations I've had with networks, it seems to have been a fairly sort of lacklustre story so far. There hasn't been a lot of take-up with opt-in. Very few retailers have offered demand-based tariffs, and those who have reported very low adoption. And as I said earlier, we're waiting to hear on the story from Actu-AGL as to whether opt-out is more successful than opt-in. But so far, it's been very slow, very incremental, very low adoption. Not really a success story, frankly. What I want to do, though, is re-examine some of the assumptions that I think might have got in the way of us having a more effective reform program and the opportunities for this time. So, and just to give you a bit of context from where Clean Energy Council came from in this, we support more cost-reflective tariffs, but we are very cautious about the implementation because we are based in Victoria. That's where our head office is. We supported the mandatory rollout of smart meters in Victoria. We thought that was a good reform at the time, and didn't that go pear-shaped? We can't afford to have another experience like that again, so we can't afford to have cost-reflective tariffs blow up in our face in the same way that the smart meter rollout in Victoria did. And so this needs to be done well. What we think doing it well looks like is not annoying customers by complicating their lives even more with forcing behaviour change and getting them to turn things on and off at different times, but to have prices and a technology solution that can respond to price signals. Our concern the last time around was that even in Victoria, where we have 100% smart meters, we didn't feel the technology was at the right point to really take advantage and really provide the solutions. And that's coming from someone who represents the companies who would be selling these solutions. So we ought to be enthusiastic advocates, but 2 or 3 years ago, batteries really weren't quite there, smart home energy management systems really weren't quite there for a mass rollout and to really take advantage of those opportunities. That has moved on a bit now. We're in a better position to sell technology solutions to make customers' lives easy in response to demand tariffs. But before I jump in and start advocating the technology solution, I just want to go back and re-examine some of the assumptions that we made last time around. So my take on the assumptions, and I came into this conversation a little bit late in the piece, so a lot of this reform conversation had been happening by the time I started getting involved in the consultation. So my perspective on what the assumptions were a directive from COAG Energy Council for networks to start charging on the basis of long-run marginal costs. We translated that to mean, that means demand-based tariffs. We got to a point where we said, right, so networks should be charging demand tariffs to retailers. Those retailers can and should pass them through to customers. And then customers will either change their behaviour, this is what we push back on, or better would be provide them with a technology solution when we're ready to do that. Now, I want to re-examine one of those assumptions. Last time it was all about from my perspective, in the consultations, it was all about the customer. And the conversation had moved on to an assumption that the implementation was going to be demand tariffs down to the customer level. How is the customer going to respond? How does the vulnerable customer respond to that? What packages do we have to make sure that, you know, people who find it difficult for whatever reason to change their consumption pattern, whether they're a pensioner or a family or something who just can't move from consuming electricity at peak, or whether they're a dairy farmer who has to milk the cows at certain times of the day and just can't move. A lot of the conversation, it seemed to me, was focused down on how are we going to address the impact on these customers who are going to do it tough. And so that was a lot of the conversation. And I think that's where we got caught up, and that's where politicians got nervous. They started seeing the risks of creating losers, and particularly in Victoria, where that experience of smart meters is still quite raw, there was no appetite by politicians to risk a customer backlash over demand-based tariffs. So it really didn't happen, other than a fairly incremental program of bringing it in for businesses with thresholds that progressively lower, which is not a bad way to begin, and we were supportive of that approach, much more comfortable with that than bringing it on at the residential level last time around. But I think this time around, we ought to make the conversation a lot more about retailers and a lot less about customers, because I think part of the mistake we made last time is we not only had a conversation about what risks the retailers were going to need to bear in future, which is the financial risk of a demand-based tariff being passed on from the networks. We also got into this conversation about how the retailers should manage the risk, and an assumption that the way that they should manage the risk is pass that demand tariff onto the customers. And then we quickly moved on from that conversation to worrying about the end consumer and how they were going to adjust. I don't think we ought to be telling the retailer how to manage their risk. So if the retailer thinks that the best way to manage this risk is to pass the demand tariff onto the consumer, and maybe the consumer will like them for it, or maybe they won't, well, that's up to the retailer. They know the consumer better than I do, so they can make that decision. But if the retailer decides that actually their customers don't want their life to be more complicated, and for whatever reason they can't buy batteries and they can't buy smart energy systems or whatever, and so the retailer decides, well, what I'm going to do is just wear that financial risk or manage it by buying a big battery and sticking it on the network and pumping out power when it's needed, or contracting that service from someone else who does it for me, well, let the retailer worry about that. Why are we overthinking this and deciding that the way to manage it is to pass it to the consumer and then spending all of our life worrying about the impacts on the consumer? Some retailers might pass it on to the consumer. I'm guaranteed many won't, and customers will have the option of going to retailers that offer vanilla packages. And this is a conversation and a debate I hope I can get into with my colleagues on the dais here, because in some telephone conversations before this, we had some spirited conversations about would it be a good thing to have all this demand tariff reform and the customer ends up seeing a boring flat tariff that doesn't change and none of their behaviour changes. And from my perspective, I said, yeah, that's good. Look, as long as the price signal from the distribution network gets passed on to the retailer, we've achieved the objective of the reforms. And if the life of the consumer doesn't get overly complicated, that's fine. If the consumer really likes to engage with electricity pricing and wants to opt in and wants to buy technology, well, my members will sell them batteries and that's all good. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.